Good morning again. So we're going to talk a little bit about what happens at the end of Acts chapter 4, the beginning of Acts chapter 5, all the way into Acts chapter 6. I tried to go all the way to 7, but I just couldn't pull it off unless you wanted to stay here for several hours. The church, in its newest days, begins to reveal what the Spirit has in mind when it comes to disciples being noted as witnesses, representatives, and voices of the message and person of Jesus. In other words, these early days help us to catch a glimpse of who the church is intended to be: a new kind of community. A community that stands in defiance to the ways of the empire, as a means to challenge the demands of the religious, and as a point of shaping, forming, and pruning within both the inner life and the life lived by the emerging disciples. Some of the hallmarks of this are found in the ways that this new community moved from separation into a picture of joining. Different cultures, languages, and perspectives are invited to be joined together by the Spirit. And what is most surprising is the ways in which this joining spreads from theoretical into practical, hands-on, real-time transformation. A move from learning about Jesus and thinking about Jesus and preaching about Jesus to ones who are surrendered to love. So surrendered to the message and teaching of Jesus that they do the unbelievable, the impractical, and the difficult with great joy and great purpose. They hold everything in common. They share their possessions. People begin selling property to care for the poor and the apostles. And the amazing thing is that those who are a part of the church, those connected and impacted and surrounded by the church, among them there are no people in need. Everybody has enough. The stories that emerge are powerful, and they're ones that stand out, like the story of Barnabas, who takes a field and he sells it, and he gives the proceeds to the apostles, to the church, to the community, those that they have been entrusted to. Now, this is both impractical and dangerous, challenging and idealistic. But this is also a picture of the church. But as Barnabas is named by Luke, we are soon introduced to another couple. They come together and sell some of their property as well, and they present it to the community and claim that what they have presented is the full amount, but the problem is that it isn't. The couple, this pairing, Ananias and Sapphira, have found themselves in the space of temptation, conniving and conspiring together. In this moment, they see that the community belongs to them rather than seeing that they belong to the community. They decide that even though the sale of property, the giving of extravagant gifts are no requirement for belonging, yet they desire any benefit associated with that narrative without actually participating in the narrative. In other words, they see this new community that is emerging and being formed by the Spirit as something to manipulate, to use, and even to own and control, rather than allowing themselves to simply be ones who belong to the community. For if they imagine themselves as ones who belonged to the community rather than ones who see that the community belongs to them, they could have easily offered only what they desire to give, with little need to inflate their actions as a tool to wield power within the community. But Ananias and Sapphira famously choose to pursue an action that belittles both the community that is being built and the Spirit that is doing the building. In this moment, as they lie to the community, they decide that their individual wants and needs and desires as a couple supersede that and those of the community. And Peter notes that their fault is not simply that they lie to the community, but rather this is an act of lying to the Spirit, and the result is death. Jennings notes that while some passages of Scripture seem to allow death and violence at the hands of humans, in this passage it seems significant that it is not the apostles or fellow disciples that have a hand in this. Rather, God takes from Ananias and Sapphira what only God gives: life. He says, if it is perceived that God had given to others this power to take life, God is certainly now reclaiming its right and keeping it from the apostles. He goes on to note that the Spirit is moving. At this moment of full divinity identified, God, the Holy Spirit, is giving discernment or deception and bringing judgment on unfaithful actions. And while this conversation is about money, perhaps it's also about the ways that we not only allow, but also promote the idea that the highest value and the highest purpose and highest mission in life is to be a couple. To elevate the pockets of individualization that allow us to focus on me and mine while ignoring what is witnessed within and among the community. Jennings suggests that Christians often turn marriage from an act of worship into an object of worship and turn the couple from a shared journey of disciples into the end goal of discipleship. And what is presented here and what we see so often is this challenging idolization of a specific status and position, of the intimacy that many have attempted as a means to replace the beautiful vision of community with the radically insufficient individualization that is found in this type of coupling. This is not some kind of argument against marriage or against couples or against the specialness of the relationship, but perhaps this is a reminder that when the couple is elevated as the height of community and intimacy, it is easy to imagine that the community belongs to them rather than seeing that they belong to the community. And this concept becomes so profound within Christendom that we can see the ways that this notion is prevalent beyond the idea of the couple or the family unit, but can also be said of the ways that we see government, of the cliques that we create, of the groups we establish, of the priorities and systems and structures that we elevate. We can see this idea that emerges from reading about Ananias and Sapphira, who insist that the community that the Spirit is building belongs to them and that they do not belong to the community, as something that the church at times even promotes. The church can give this idea that by virtue of our statuses or our privilege, our power, our limitations, our commitments, our perspectives, our disagreements, our ideas, our differences, that some can and should see the community as something they own rather than as something that they participate in. But what might happen if we saw ourselves as this kind of community that offers the parts we want to hold on to for ourselves, the pieces we want to ignore, the parts we wish were not our reality, and we offered them in Spirit-led ways to the community? Imagine if just in this space, we too could say with vigor that there are no needy among us. Because somehow the community understands that while we are called to be witnesses to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and beyond, we are also called to be witnesses right here with one another. What would it look like for you to say that the community that is this congregation, that is our denomination, or even fellow churches within Calgary, does not belong to you, but that you belong to the community? In Acts 5, Ananias and Sapphira choose to live as though all they need is each other. In essence, they re-employ the systems of a world that insisted the highest value is me and mine. They chose to see themselves as not a part of the community, but as somehow outside of and over the community, thus making the vision of the church as the space of joining, of refining, of shaping, of forming, of defiance to all that insisted a few could and perhaps even should dominate, nothing more than a copy, a cheap facsimile of the very things that the Spirit had come to dismantle and unravel. What a lesson for the modern church. That the community the Spirit builds and breathes into life is never meant to be a mere copy of the systems and the stories and the ideology and the rhetoric that is found within the corridors of religiosity or the monuments of the empire. But as the story is told, this is so offensive to the mission and to the work, to what is happening, that this couple come face to face with death. And Jennings writes that the life and well-being of a couple and their children easily command our greatest loyalties and constantly draw us toward supporting policies of governments and the practices of corporations that destroy life and harm the planet. The actions of Ananias and Sapphira in withholding part of their resources is precisely the gesture that seems sensible, but opens them to falsehood and resistance to the Spirit. Christians should allow their discipleship to be a witness of discipleship, not by how they display an obsessive commitment to each other and their offspring, but how they help a community enter into a greater reality of vulnerability, sharing, and intimate life. Now, I want you to know that everything I just said is stuff that I think is absolute garbage. So everything inside of me wants to resist that kind of idea. A lot of what the Bible talks about are the very things I don't want to do. Is that not true? It's kind of fun to take stuff that doesn't belong to you sometimes. It's kind of nice to rise to the top and to take it all. But as I may want to resist this, the way of being that Luke describes in these early chapters, it leaves me without the individualization that defines my culture. It leaves me without the ways that I want to live. It leaves me without the control I so desire to make sure that I am taken care of, even if the person beside me is not. This passage leaves me with the unfortunate reality that I am responsible for the one who mourns beside me, the one who rejoices around me, and even those that just drive me a little bit crazy. And frankly, it just seems impossible, if not impractical. But when we find ourselves moving through the remainder of the text, we see that the opposite of Ananias and Sapphira's story begins to be played out by the apostles and the growing church. There are healings and baptisms. Evil spirits bow down and the church multiplies. But all of this is happening against a backdrop, against a system, against a way of being that wants this new kind of community, this new kind of family that the Spirit is building to be silenced, to be stopped, and to be disbanded. And so yet again, the apostles are arrested, and yet again, the Spirit is at work. The doors of the prison are open, and they are compelled to go and tell the story of the Messiah. This story of liberation, this story of on earth as it is in heaven, but the powerful, the fearful, those unable to recognize what the Spirit is building and breathing, attempt yet again to silence them. But the apostles are less concerned about self-interest or self-preservation or the unending temptation to protect what is and what can only be theirs. Instead, they find themselves focused and invested and interconnected with this new community, with this new kind of family, this new way of being that insists they must be witnesses of Jesus wherever they find themselves. Everything that they do is because of Jesus and the direction they move in, even when it walks them towards danger, towards greater surrender, towards greater scrutiny and demise. They always choose to belong to the community and to belong to the way of Jesus. How very different from Ananias and Sapphira. And so we meet them freshly released from jail. They immediately go back to the temple, and once again, they are confronted and asked to be silent. But one of the religious leaders gives those who are questioning them pause as he suggests if the apostles are forming this new community, this new way of being on their own, it will soon be over. But if it is from God, you can never overthrow it. In fact, if you do, you may end up fighting against God. This leader is so close to stepping into this new way of being. He is so close to participating in the work of the Spirit's joining. He's so close to seeing that the Jesus they speak of is indeed the way that they too can follow. But once again, we are reminded of what happens when we insist that we must stand outside of this new way of being, that we must stand outside of this new kind of community. We become observers of God's goodness. We become observers of God's faithfulness, observers of God at work in new and unexpected ways. We become mere observers of the Spirit bringing the unlikely together, of the Spirit undoing locks and chains. We become mere observers of the beautiful work of joining that can only happen where the Spirit of the Lord resides. But the apostles, even as they are told to be quiet, even as they are told to sit down, even as they are flogged and jailed, belittled and despised, recognize that they belong to the community and they cannot and they will not stop being a witness of Jesus wherever it is that they find themselves. But community is hard. And when we choose to say that the community does not belong to us, but rather that we belong to the community, it means that when we see or hear or discover that some are being marginalized, that some are being made to feel as though this community is not for them, when we hear that some are being asked to sit down or sit back and to be satisfied with mere crumbs while others feast, we do not do what those who chose to be observers do. We do not do what those who wanted to silence the community do. We do not do and we do not respond as those who have not seen the Spirit of God fall upon the rich and the poor, the sick and the well, the women and the children, the foreigners, the strangers, the powerful and the weak with equal measure. We do not respond as ones who have not experienced the revolution of community that the Spirit has ushered in. When we hear, when we see, when we discover that the pull to insist that the community belongs to some is rising and gaining strength, rather than the understanding that all belong to the community, we enact change. And in Acts chapter 6, as the Greek-speaking widows insist that they are being asked not to belong to what the Spirit has called them to, the apostles, and we can say the community, gather together and they bring about resolution to ensure there is an equitable way forward. They want to make sure that both those who have always belonged and those who are new to this idea of joining, that they can find their way forward. They will not allow one group to respond as though the community only belongs to them. Instead, they do the work of reminding each other that this growing, fledgling, emerging church, they all belong to the community, and they all belong to one another. And in Acts 6, verse 7, it says, the message continued to spread. The community continued to expand, to make space. Tables are widened, relationships are built, understanding is growing, community is building. And despite all of the reasons why it would have made more sense, time and time again, to be more akin to Ananias and Sapphira, ones unwilling to belong when it's hard, when it's costly, when it's difficult, when it's challenging, the church persists, the Spirit moves, and the community grows as they surrender to love, ensuring there were no needy among them. What does it look like for us to say that there are no needy among us? What does it mean in our context to suggest that we hold all things in common? What does it look like for us to build in the direction that the Spirit is building and insist that the community does not belong to some, but rather we all belong to the community. I'll ask the worship team to come forward. I will close with this quote. Imagine love for one another that turns its attention to a widening circle beyond me and mind, toward a world that must know the exact same love. How could such disciples withhold time and talent or treasure from the needs of a community and a world that God has bound them to by love? Let's stand together. I'm gonna ask, can we sing that last part over in just a moment? When we talk about this idea of what I call impractical and impossible things that God calls us to, and then we sing a song that says, all my life God has been faithful. All of my life I have seen God's goodness follow us, yet we find it so hard to follow where it is the Spirit is leading for fear of what it is that we might lose, for fear of what it might cost. It is so much easier to be like Ananias and Sapphira and to seek out the power that is found in the community, to seek out what it is you can gain, rather than to be participants, rather than to consider what is it that it looks like for all of us to have what we need. Not just when we think about money, that is far too small. But what does it look like for a community to really care about one another? To understand one another, to be invested in one another, to help one another to rise. What does that look like? And do we have faith enough to say, all my life you've been faithful and you will also be faithful in this which is impossible, in this which is impractical, in this which moves me from being an observer to a participant. As we go today, we want to send our fathers with a blessing. And so these words, written by Cole Arthur Riley, I hope that they carry you through. We thank you for our fathers, those with us and those gone before us. Those who held us and showed us what it means to belong to one another. In a society that demands a single portrait of the masculine, would you awaken memories and stories of the tenderness of fathers? That our narrative would not allow the men in our lives to be reduced. And for those of us who have longed for their father more than they have been held by him, would you grant them space to lament? To grieve in the way that they need to? Would you place people in their lives to remind them they are no less worthy of love? Liberate them to name their deepest longing, that they would not be rushed from their grieving. May they be held and loved and known. For fathers who read us stories, who worked 2 jobs, who told us we were beautiful, who taught us how to stay alive, who are alone or tired, who are gone too soon. Happy Father's Day. Have a blessed week.